In the architecture of human societies, certain truths become so threatening to established order that entire communities develop elaborate mechanisms not merely to suppress them, but to create shared hallucinations of their non-existence. These are not simple lies or casual deceptions, but rather massive coordinated efforts involving thousands of participants who collectively agree to unsee what stands directly before their eyes. Charleston, South Carolina, in the years leading up to the American Civil War, had perfected this art of collective blindness to a degree that would have been remarkable had anyone been willing to acknowledge it. The city presented itself to the world as a pinnacle of refined civilization. Its architecture spoke of European sophistication transplanted to American soil. Elegant townhouses with their distinctive ironwork balconies, inspired by patterns from New Orleans, and ultimately from Spain, lined cobblestone streets that had witnessed nearly 2 centuries of commerce and culture. The grand plantations surrounding the city, with their thousands of acres devoted to rice cultivation, generated wealth that flowed through Charleston's port and into the pockets of families whose names had been synonymous with power since colonial times. Behind these impressive facades, however, lived uncomfortable realities that everyone had agreed to ignore with such determination that the agreement itself had become invisible. The silence was so complete, so thoroughly internalized, that most people had ceased to recognize they were maintaining it. It had become simply the way things were, as natural and unremarkable as the humid climate or the particular accent that marked Charleston's speech. Dr. William Hutchkins first began to perceive the outlines of this conspiracy during what should have been an entirely routine medical encounter in the spring of 1847. He had arrived in Charleston only months earlier, a physician of 33 years whose credentials from Boston medical institutions were respectable, if not outstanding. He had come south seeking opportunity in a region whose prosperity seemed boundless, where the cotton and rice economy generated wealth at rates that made northern commerce seem sluggish by comparison. His status as a northerner already placed him at the margins of Charleston society. City's elite were not hostile to outsiders exactly, but they maintained certain reservations, a watchfulness that suggested he would need to prove himself worthy of full acceptance. His Boston education, his Yankee accent, his unfamiliarity with Southern customs, these marked him as someone who required observation, someone who might not understand how things properly worked. The medical case that would alter his understanding of Charleston began ordinarily enough. An overseer from the Fairmont plantation, one of the largest rice-growing operations in the region, brought a young boy to Hutchkins's office. The child, perhaps 7 years old, had fallen from a wagon and injured his arm. The fracture was clean, nothing complicated, and Hutchkins set about his work with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed such procedures hundreds of times. But as he examined the boy, cleaned and set the broken bone, wrapped it carefully in bandages, and explained the recovery process to the overseer, Hutchkins found his attention caught by something that had nothing to do with the medical injury. The child's face possessed features that struck Hutchkins with growing unease, precisely because they seemed so familiar, though he couldn't immediately place why. Then the connection formed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Just 2 weeks earlier, Hutchkins had attended a dinner party at the home of a prominent merchant where he had been seated near Colonel Thomas Fairmont, the owner of the plantation from which this child had come. The colonel was a man of distinctive appearance, not handsome exactly, but memorable. He possessed an unusual combination of grey-green eyes, quite rare, set in a narrow face with a pronounced cleft chin. His nose was thin and slightly aquiline, his ears set close to his head in a particular way. The boy being treated for a broken arm possessed every single one of these distinctive characteristics. The eyes were identical in their unusual coloring and placement. The cleft chin was unmistakable, the nose, the ears, even the shape of the hands, as Hutchkins examined them, all bore an uncanny similarity that went far beyond coincidence. This wasn't a matter of 1 or 2 shared features that might be explained by chance. It was a complete replication of facial architecture that could only mean one thing. Hutchkins said nothing. He finished his treatment, provided careful instructions to the overseer about caring for the injury, accepted his fee, and sent them on their way. But the observation had lodged itself in his consciousness, like a foreign object, impossible to ignore or dislodge. His medical training had taught him to observe human bodies with systematic attention to detail, to note patterns and variations. What he had just observed was a pattern that pointed toward a conclusion that somehow seemed both obvious and impossible to speak aloud. Over the weeks and months that followed, Hutchkins began noticing similar patterns throughout Charleston with a frequency that suggested this was no isolated occurrence, but rather a widespread phenomenon. His medical practice brought him into contact with households across the social spectrum, from the wealthiest plantation families to modest merchants, to the enslaved people who worked in kitchens, gardens, and fields throughout the city and surrounding countryside, in the Western household, where he had been called to treat the mistress for various minor ailments. He encountered a girl of perhaps 10 years old who worked in the kitchen. Her skin was several shades darker than the Western family members, marking her as part of the enslaved population. Yet she possessed the same distinctive auburn hair that characterized Mrs. Adelaide Weston and her daughters, a shade quite unusual, with reddish highlights that caught the light in a particular way. More than that, she had the same pattern of freckles across her nose and cheeks, the same green eyes, the same basic facial structure beneath the difference in skin tone. At the Reynolds estate, where Judge Marcus Reynolds employed him occasionally to attend to household members, Hutchkins observed a young boy working as a servant who bore the judge's most distinctive features: a prominent forehead that seemed almost oversized, wide-set eyes that gave his face an open quality, and a particular shape to the jawline that Hutchkins had noticed immediately when first meeting the judge. The resemblance was precise enough to be almost eerie in its exactness. On the Pritchard plantation, belonging to one of Charleston's wealthiest merchants, he glimpsed a teenage girl working in the household who possessed the same aquiline nose and high, prominent cheekbones that made Edmund Pritchard's face so recognizable in Charleston's business circles. The similarity was striking enough that Hutchkins found himself staring before catching himself and looking away. These were not subtle resemblances that required imagination to detect. They were obvious, unmistakable replications of facial features, genetic inheritance, written plainly on human faces for anyone willing to look, and that was what disturbed Hutchkins most profoundly, not the resemblances themselves, whose implications were clear enough, but the absolute pervasive silence that surrounded them. No one spoke of it. Not the enslaved people who must have understood the reality of their own parentage or that of their children. Not the white families who saw these living mirrors of themselves moving through their households daily. Not the overseers who managed plantation labor. Not the merchants who conducted business. Not the ministers who preached about morality and truth from pulpits every Sunday. An entire population, thousands of people, had collectively agreed to simply not see what was directly visible before their eyes. Hutchkins was not by nature or inclination a crusader for social justice. He had not come to Charleston with any particular moral mission or reformist agenda. At 33, he was an ambitious professional seeking to establish himself in a prosperous region where opportunities seemed abundant for a skilled physician. He had observed the success of the Southern economy, the wealth that flowed through Charleston's commercial networks, and he wanted to claim his portion of that prosperity. He wanted a successful practice, respect from his peers, eventual marriage to a suitable woman from a good family, and the comfortable life that professional success could provide. But his medical training had instilled in him certain habits of mind that proved incompatible with Charleston's conspiracy of silence. As a physician, he had been taught to observe carefully, to note patterns in symptoms and physical characteristics, to document findings systematically, and to draw conclusions based on evidence rather than social convenience. The scientific method demanded acknowledgement of observable reality, even when that reality proved uncomfortable or contradicted established beliefs. This systematic approach to observation was what made Hutchkins dangerous to Charleston's carefully maintained fictions, though he didn't yet fully understand the threat he represented. He began keeping notes in a private journal, initially without any particular plan or purpose. Documentation was simply his professional habit. When he observed something medically or scientifically interesting, he recorded it. The journal became a repository for his observations about family resemblances, dated and described with the same careful attention to detail he would apply to documenting symptoms of disease. He told himself this was mere scientific curiosity, a physician's natural tendency to observe and record patterns in human heredity and physical characteristics. He had no specific intention of publishing these observations or confronting anyone with them. They were simply notes, private documentation of an interesting phenomenon he had noticed in his adopted city. His first opportunity to discuss the matter with Samo, who might understand, came unexpectedly at a dinner party hosted by a prosperous merchant family named Bogard in late June of 1847. The evening was typical of Charleston's social season, warm and humid despite the late hour, with the heavy scent of jasmine drifting in from the garden. The company was refined, consisting of prominent families and a few carefully selected newcomers like Hutchkins, who were being evaluated for potential inclusion in Charleston's inner circles. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine being poured with practiced elegance by enslaved servants who moved through the rooms almost invisibly. Topics ranged from politics in Washington to commercial prospects for the cotton crop to social gossip about families and marriages. Everything was pleasant, civilized, carefully calibrated to demonstrate education and refinement, without ever approaching controversy or genuine substance. After the meal concluded, the women retired to the drawing room as was customary, leaving the men to linger over brandy and cigars. Hutchkins found himself gradually drifting away from the main group, stepping out onto the veranda, where the air was slightly less oppressive. He stood watching fireflies dance patterns in the garden below, their small lights appearing and disappearing in the darkness like scattered stars. Reverend Jonathan Sawyer, an elderly minister who had served Charleston's churches for over 4 decades, joined him on the veranda after a few minutes. The Reverend was a figure of considerable respect in the community. At 70 years old, he had baptized, married, and buried multiple generations of Charleston's families. His voice still carried authority despite his age, and his mind remained sharp, capable of subtle distinctions and careful reasoning that came from decades of navigating the complicated terrain of Southern religion and morality. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Hutchkins, perhaps emboldened by the brandy, or perhaps simply unable to contain his confusion any longer, decided to raise the topic that had been occupying his thoughts for months. He chose his words with care, aware that he was venturing into uncertain territory, but unable to resist the impulse to speak what he had been observing. The conversation that followed proved illuminating in ways Hutchkins had not anticipated. Reverend Sawyer didn't deny the observations or pretend not to understand what Hutchkins was referring to. Instead, he acknowledged the reality with a directness that was almost startling, then immediately proceeded to explain why that reality must never be spoken aloud in public. The Reverend's voice was gentle but firm, carrying an undertone that suggested this was not the first time he had engaged in such a conversation. He positioned himself as a teacher, instructing a somewhat naive student about the complexities of the world, offering wisdom gained through long experience and careful observation of human natu. And social dynamics. Hutchkins was new to Charleston, the Reverend noted, and certain things that might seem unusual or troubling to northern eyes were in fact necessary accommodations to the realities of life in the South. The resemblances Hutchkins had observed were indeed real, obvious to anyone who looked, but there were very good reasons why looking too closely or speaking too openly about such matters would serve no useful purpose and would in fact cause considerable harm. When Hutchkins protested that this seemed to be a matter of observable fact rather than regional differences in perspective, the Reverend shifted his argument to more practical ground. He asked Hutchkins to consider what would actually happen if these resemblances were publicly acknowledged. If people stood up in churches and social gatherings and declared the true parentage of various children throughout Charleston, the consequences, Reverend Sawyer explained with the patience of someone who had thought through these implications many times, would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Marriages would dissolve under the weight of public acknowledgement of betrayals that everyone currently chose to overlook. Families would be torn apart by inheritance disputes as legitimate and illegitimate children fought over estates and property. The social fabric that held Charleston together would unravel in recriminations and legal battles, and the children themselves, both those acknowledged as legitimate and those currently unacknowledged, would suffer consequences they had done nothing to deserve. The acknowledged children would bear the shame of their fathers' or mothers' infidelities becoming public knowledge. The unacknowledged children would lose whatever small advantages they currently possessed, advantages that existed precisely because of the silence. The Reverend revealed something that Hutchkins had indeed observed but hadn't fully considered. Many of the enslaved children who bore obvious family resemblances received certain preferential treatment compared to others in their situation. Better clothing, lighter work duties, sometimes even instruction in reading or a skilled trade. These small mercies existed in a space of plausible deniability. They could be explained as kindness to favored servants, or recognition of particularly useful workers rather than acknowledgement of blood relationships. If the relationships were spoken aloud, made explicit and public, those advantages would vanish. The resemblances would transform from unspoken private arrangements into public scandals. The social pressure to eliminate any special treatment would become irresistible, and the children would lose whatever small compensations they currently received for their complicated positions. The Reverend's tone throughout this explanation was kind, almost paternal, which somehow made his words more chilling to Hutchkins. He wasn't threatening or even particularly stern. He was simply stating facts about how Charleston society operated, delivered with the certainty that came from decades of experience navigating these complicated realities. He was offering Hutchkins an education in how the world actually worked, as opposed to how idealistic theories suggested it should work. Truth, the Reverend suggested, was not as straightforward a virtue as Hutchkins seemed to believe. Sometimes silence was the more compassionate choice, the option that caused less suffering even if it violated certain abstract principles about honesty and acknowledgement. A minister of 43 years had learned through countless pastoral encounters that human relationships were too complex, too messy, too full of contradictions to be governed by simple rules about always speaking truth aloud. He placed a hand on Hutchkins's shoulder as he concluded, a gesture that managed to be both supportive and warning. Charleston welcomed the young doctor, needed his medical skills, and offered him the prospect of a prosperous, respected life. But every community had its customs, its particular ways of managing difficult truths. Hutchkins would be wise to give himself time to understand Charleston's customs before deciding to challenge them. The conversation moved to other topics, and the evening continued pleasantly enough. Hutchkins returned to his lodgings through Charleston's humid night streets, past houses where candles flickered in windows and enslaved people moved silently through the shadows. Performing the work that kept the city functioning, but he felt as if he had been initiated into something profound and disturbing. Not just knowledge of specific facts about children and parentage, but awareness of a vast unspoken conspiracy that everyone participated in maintaining. The following week brought an invitation that Hutchkins initially interpreted as a simple social courtesy from a grateful patient. Mrs. Constance Hartwell, a widow of considerable social standing and substantial independent wealth, requested his presence for tea at her home. He had treated her on 2 previous occasions for minor medical complaints, arthritis that affected her hands and a persistent cough that had worried her, though it proved relatively minor. He assumed this was merely a polite thank you gesture, perhaps an opportunity to pay her bill in person rather than through servants. He was entirely wrong about the nature and purpose of the invitation, as became clear almost immediately upon his arrival at the Hartwell residence. The house itself was a testament to wealth and refined taste. European furniture pieces that had been imported at considerable expense, paintings by artists whose work commanded respect in cultured circles, silver tea service that gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows draped with fabric that had likely cost more than Hutchkins earned in a month. A young enslaved girl, perhaps 14 years old, served the tea with a practiced efficiency. The tea came from extensive training, then was dismissed so that Mrs. Hartwell and Hutchkins could speak privately. After the customary pleasantries about the weather and various Charleston families, Mrs. Hartwell set down her teacup and came directly to the point with a bluntness that caught Hutchkins off guard. She had heard, she informed him, that he had been making certain observations about Charleston's families and asking questions about matters that were generally considered private. His discussions with Reverend Sawyer had been noted. His tendency to make comparisons between various children and their supposed employers had not gone unremarked among those who paid attention to such things. Hutchkins felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. He attempted to deflect, claiming he wasn't sure what she meant, but Mrs. Hartwell cut through this evasion with sharp impatience. She was not interested in games or pretense. Charleston was a small community where information traveled quickly among those who mattered, and his activities had definitely attracted attention from people who had both the interest and the power to respond. His protests that he had done nothing improper, that observation was the foundation of his medical profession, were met with a response that reframed the entire issue. The impropriety, Mrs. Hartwell explained, lay not in the specific actions he had taken, but in the fact that he was examining something the community had collectively chosen not to examine. This violated an understanding that everyone else had managed to grasp, an unspoken agreement about what could and could not be openly discussed. She asked him, with a directness that demanded honest engagement, what possible good he imagined could come from giving voice to his observations. What did he hope to achieve? What positive outcome did he envision resulting from his documentation and questions? It was a fair question, one that Hutchkins had increasingly been asking himself. What exactly was his purpose in noting these resemblances? What did he hope to accomplish with his journal full of documented cases? He fell back on abstractions about truth and facts mattering, which prompted a bitter laugh from Mrs. Hartwell. Truth, she responded, was a luxury, an expensive, destructive luxury that Hutchkins apparently couldn't afford to recognize as such. She proceeded to lay out in practical terms what truth would mean in this specific context. It would mean public acknowledgement of private matters that had been carefully kept private for very good reasons. It would mean the destruction of families, the complication of inheritances as people fought over property and legitimacy, the upending of social structures that provided order and stability to thousands of lives, both among the free population and the enslaved, and the children themselves. She challenged him. What would truth actually give them? The ability to claim legal recognition from their fathers? Rights to inheritance? No. The law would never support such claims, regardless of how obvious the biological relationships might be. Truth would give these children nothing but confirmation of circumstances they could not change. At best, it would satisfy curiosity. At worst, it would burden them with painful knowledge that served no practical purpose whatsoever. Mrs. Hartwell pointed out something Hutchkins knew to be accurate. The children he had noticed were being cared for adequately, even preferentially in many cases. They were fed, clothed, housed. Many were taught valuable trades that would serve them well. Some were even given their freedom eventually, though always quietly through supposedly unrelated circumstances that maintained plausible deniability about the reasons. What would Hutchkins's truth add to their lives except complication, except the burden of explicit knowledge about relationships that could never be officially acknowledged or legally supported? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that Hutchkins found himself unable to provide convincingly. Sensing that she had made her philosophical point, Mrs. Hartwell shifted to more direct warning. She told him a story about a young lawyer from Virginia named Harrison Welch, who had arrived in Charleston some 20 years earlier. This man had been brilliant, well-educated, full of ideals absorbed in university about justice and truth, and the importance of exposing hypocrisy. He had begun making noise about exactly what Hutchkins N.S. had been observing. He declared his intention to expose the truth, to write about it, to publish his findings in newspapers up north, where they would receive the attention he believed they deserved. He was going to tear away Charleston's veil of silence and force acknowledgement of what everyone pretended not to see. What happened to him, Mrs. Hartwell explained with a faint smile that suggested she had personally witnessed some of this story, was nothing dramatic or violent. There were no threats, no physical confrontations, nothing so crude or obvious. His practice simply failed. No clients hired him for legal work. Cases that might have come his way went to other attorneys. Invitations to social events stopped arriving. When he attempted to rent better lodgings, landlords always had some excuse about prior commitments or other prospective tenants. His credit with Charleston's merchants dried up as shops that had been happy to extend him accounts suddenly required immediate payment. Within 6 months, the brilliant young lawyer had left Charleston professionally ruined and financially broken. Last Mrs. Hartwell had heard, he was working as a clerk in Richmond. All his promise wasted, all his brilliance dimmed to nothing because he had failed to understand how Charleston worked, had failed to recognize that when an entire community agreed on something, even silently, even without explicit coordination, that agreement possessed tremendous force. She was not telling him this, Oh, frighten him, Mrs. Hartwell assured him as she stood to signal the interview's conclusion, but rather to help him understand the reality of his situation. Charleston was not cruel, but it was unified in ways that outsiders often failed to grasp until too late. The silence about certain matters was not maintained through active conspiracy or coordinated effort, but rather through something more organic and therefore more powerful, a collective understanding that operated almost unconsciously. When someone swam against that current, they discovered its strength too late to save themselves. She extended her hand in parting, expressing confidence that Hutchkins would make the wise choice about his future course of action. After leaving Mrs. Hartwell's elegant home, Hutchkins walked for hours through Charleston's streets as afternoon turned to evening. Gas lamps began flickering to life on corners. Vendors in the market packed up their wares. Churches with their white steeples reached toward the darkening sky. Families gathered for dinner in homes where voices and laughter drifted through open windows, creating a tapestry of ordinary domestic life. He realized with a pang of genuine emotion that he loved Charleston. He loved the graceful architecture that spoke of European sophistication. He loved the intellectual society he had begun to enter, conversations with educated men about literature and science and politics. He loved the sense of history that permeated every street, the awareness of walking where generations had walked before. His practice was growing steadily. He had been invited to join a prestigious medical society. His future in this city had seemed bright with promise. But could he live with the silence? Could he participate in the conspiracy of unseeing that everyone else had accepted as simply the way things were? That night, seated at his desk in the small house he rented on Church Street, he stared at his journal, the pages of observations he had compiled over the past months. Names, descriptions, documented resemblances, case after case meticulously recorded with dates and details. Jacob, age 7, enslaved at Fairmont Plantation. Resemblance to Colonel Thomas Fairmont unmistakable, grey-green eyes extremely rare, pronounced cleft chin, narrow aquiline nose, similar ear shape and placement. Mother listed as Rachel, kitchen worker, approximately 28 years old. Mary, age 10, enslaved at Western household. Resemblance to Adelaide Weston striking. Auburn hair, very unusual in enslaved population. Freckled complexion, green eyes, similar facial structure beneath difference in skin tone. Mother listed as Sarah, laundress, approximately 32 years old. Samuel, age 8, enslaved at Reynolds Estate. Resemblance to Judge Marcus Reynolds, precise, prominent oversized forehead, wide-set eyes, distinctive jawline, similar height for age suggesting inherited build. Mother listed as Dinah, seamstress, approximately 35 year. Old. The list continued, page after page, each entry a documented case of resemblance so striking it defied coincidental explanation, each entry representing a truth that everyone saw but no one acknowledged. What was it all for? What did he hope to achieve? He thought of Jacob with his injured arm, stoic and silent as Hutchkins set the bone, never complaining despite obvious pain. He thought of Mary serving tea in the Weston household, moving with practiced grace under the supervision of Adelaide Weston, the woman who might well be her biological mother. He thought of Samuel running errands for Judge Reynolds, the resemblance so marked that people glanced twice before quickly looking away. These children were living proof of truths no one would speak. But what good would speaking those truths accomplish? What would change except that the children might lose whatever small advantages their unacknowledged status currently provided? Hutchkins made a decision that night that satisfied no one, least of all himself. He would continue his observations, continue his documentation, but he would keep them private. He would not speak of them publicly, would not write articles for newspapers, would not make accusations or force confrontations. But neither would he destroy his notes or abandon his record-keeping. He would bear witness, even if silently, even if only for himself, and whatever uncertain future might eventually care about such testimony, it was a compromise born of weakness. As much as wisdom, an accommodation to power, he lacked the strength to challenge. But it was the choice he made, and he committed to it with the same methodical determination he brought to his medical practice. The summer passed in oppressive heat and humidity that made Charleston's normally slow pace even more languid. Hutchkins settled into his practice and Charleston's social rhythms. He learned to avert his eyes, to not see what everyone else had learned not to see. He became complicit in the conspiracy of silence, though the knowledge of his complicity sat uneasily in his chest like a chronic condition he could never quite cure. He treated patients without commenting on family resemblances, no matter how obvious. He attended dinner parties without raising uncomfortable questions, no matter how much they nagged at his conscience. He smiled and nodded and made pleasant conversation. He became one more participant in Charleston's elaborate dance of denial, one more person who saw without acknowledging, who knew without speaking. But he continued writing in his journal. Every case of resemblance he encountered, he documented with the same careful attention to detail. It became a compulsion, a private ritual that allowed him to maintain some sense of himself as someone who still valued truth, even as he participated in collective fiction. The journal grew steadily, a hidden record of what Charleston refused to acknowledge. Then came September, and a case that would test the limits of Charleston's capacity for organized silence, revealing the full extent of the mechanisms society had developed to suppress truths that threatened its foundations. Senator Bradford Marchmont represented the apex of Charleston's power structure. His plantation, Riverside, encompassed over 3,000 acres of prime rice-growing land worked by hundreds of enslaved people. His political influence extended all the way to Washington, where he had served 2 terms in the Senate before returning to South Carolina to manage his extensive business interests and continue wielding power through connections and patronage networks. At 52, he was wealthy beyond most people's imagination, respected by all who mattered, and utterly untouchable by conventional means. His wife, Caroline Marchmont, was considered one of Charleston's great beauties, a woman from an old Virginia family whose lineage could be traced back to colonial aristocracy. At 38, she had given Senator Marchmont 4 healthy children, 3 sons positioned for political and commercial success, and a daughter being groomed for an advantageous marriage. Everything about the Marchmont family spoke of privilege, power, and perfect propriety. In September of 1847, Caroline Marchmont gave birth to their 5th child, a daughter they named Eleanor. Dr. Hutchkins was not the attending physician. Senator Marchmont employed Dr. Theodore Ashworth, Charleston's most expensive and most respected medical practitioner, for his family's healthcare needs. But Hutchkins heard about the birth through the usual social channels, formal announcements, congratulatory remarks at gatherings, the normal circulation of news through Charleston's tightly interconnected society. Within days, however, he began hearing other things, whispers, rumors, fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered rooms. Something was wrong with the Marchmont baby. though what exactly remained unclear through the haze of careful language and oblique references. The whispers were quiet but persistent, carrying a quality of genuine scandal rather than mere gossip. The baby Eleanor had been born, according to these fragmentary reports, with skin noticeably darker than would be expected given her parents' ancestry. Not slightly darker, in the way that sometimes occurred with newborns whose complexion lightened over time, but distinctly, unmistakably darker, darker, some whispered, than many of the enslaved children at Riverside Plantation. At first, Hutchkins dismissed this as exaggeration, fueled by Charleston's appetite for scandal. Babies were indeed sometimes born with darker complexions that changed as they matured. It was a known medical phenomenon, nothing particularly unusual or alarming. But the whispers continued with an intensity that suggested something more significant than normal variation in infant complexion. The implications, if true, were almost unthinkable. Both Senator Marchmont and his wife. Caroline came from families of unquestionable European ancestry, lineages carefully maintained and proudly documented back through generations. Senator Marchmont's family had been in South Carolina since 1690. Caroline's Virginia ancestors had arrived even earlier. There was no possibility of mixed ancestry in either family line, which meant there was only one explanation for a dark-skinned child, an explanation that violated Charleston's deepest taboos and threatened its most fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and social order. The only possibility was that Caroline Marchmont had been unfaithful to her husband, and the father of her child was almost certainly one of the enslaved men at Riverside. For a white woman of the highest social class to bear a child fathered by an enslaved man was the ultimate nightmare scenario for Charleston's power structure. It represented not just adultery, which was scandalous enough, but the inversion of all the racial and sexual hierarchies that slavery depended upon. It was the thing that kept Charleston's elite awake at night, the fear that haunted their elaborate constructions of racial superiority. But the scandal was handled in the most peculiar way imaginable, through mechanisms so coordinated and comprehensive that they revealed just how sophisticated Charleston's apparatus for suppressing truth had become over generations of practice. A birth announcement appeared in the Charleston Mercury, the city's most prominent news bar, congratulating Senator and Mrs. Marchmont on the arrival of their daughter Eleanor. The notice was brief, formal, exactly like dozens of others that appeared regularly announcing births among prominent families. Nothing in the language suggested anything unusual or problematic, but the child herself was never seen in public. No christening ceremony was held at St. Michael's Church, where the Marchmont family had worshipped for generations and where all their previous children had been baptized in elaborate ceremonies attended by Charleston's elite. No visitors were received to admire the baby, as was absolutely customary for families of their stature. Normally, the Marchmont home would have been filled with well-wishers bearing gifts and offering congratulations for weeks after such a birth. Instead, the Marchmont house, usually a center of social activity, hosting dinners and gatherings, closed its doors. The family withdrew from public view with excuses about Caroline's health requiring rest and isolation. Dr. Hutchkins, his curiosity aroused despite his resolution to mind his own business, began making discreet inquiries among his medical colleagues and other connections. What he learned was fragmentary but deeply troubling, suggesting a coordinated effort at suppression that involved dozens of people and multiple institutions. Dr. Ashworth, the attending physician who had delivered the baby, had reportedly left Charleston immediately after the birth. He had departed for New Orleans on what his wife described as urgent business matters, though the trip had apparently been completely unplanned, and the urgent business had materialized with suspicious timing. The midwife who had assisted at the birth, an enslaved woman named Patience, who was considered one of Charleston's most skilled and experienced practitioners, had been sold within a week. This was highly unusual. Patience's expertise was so valued that she had been hired out to assist at births in the finest Charleston homes for years. Her sale, and to a distant plantation in Georgia where she would be inaccessible for any future questioning, suggested someone wanted to ensure she would not be available to tell what she had witnessed. Two of the Marchmont household servants, both enslaved women who had been present in the house during and immediately after the birth, had also been sold to distant locations within days. Again, this was unusual. Household servants were typically kept for years, becoming familiar presences in the families they served. Selling experienced household staff was generally done only when absolutely necessary due to financial problems or serious behavioral issues. The Marchmonts had neither financial problems nor, apparently, any complaints about these particular servants. Within a month, word spread quietly through Charleston's social networks that little Eleanor Marchmont had died of fever. A small, private funeral was held, attended only by immediate family members. No body was displayed, which was explained by the fever having been particularly severe and disfiguring. The burial took place at the private cemetery at Riverside Plantation, rather than in Charleston proper, another departure from normal practice for a family of the Marchmonts' prominence. Charleston society responded with appropriate expressions of sympathy. Condolence cards were sent. Senator Marchmont received colleagues at his home, accepting their sorrowful words with grave dignity that impressed everyone with his strength in grief. Caroline Marchmont remained in seclusion, understandably devastated by the loss of her infant daughter. Life continued, and the scandal that might have been never materialized because the truth was never acknowledged openly enough to become official scandal. But Dr. Hutchkins, through his growing network of medical contacts and his own careful investigation, learned something entirely different. There had been no fever. The child Eleanor had not died. She was alive, hidden in plain sight through one of the most audacious deceptions Hutchkins had yet encountered. The information came to him through Dr. Marcus Fleming, a younger colleague who had recently begun practicing in Charleston after completing his training in Philadelphia. Fleming and Hutchkins had become friendly, drawn together by their shared status as outsiders, Northerners navigating the peculiar customs and unspoken rules of Charleston society. They sometimes met for drinks and conversation, finding relief in being able to speak more freely than they could in mixed company. During one of these conversations, Fleming mentioned something odd he had observed while making a house call to Riverside Plantation. He had been summoned to treat an overseer who had broken his leg in a fall, a straightforward case that required setting and splinting the bone. But while at Riverside attending to this patient, he had glimpsed something that struck him as strange. In one of the cabins housing enslaved families, he had seen a very young infant, couldn't have been more than a few weeks old at most, being cared for by a couple who already had several other children. Nothing particularly unusual about that except for one detail. The baby looked nothing like the couple supposedly raising it. The parents were both quite dark-skinned, as were their other children. But this infant was noticeably lighter, still darker than white but clearly of mixed ancestry, what would be termed mulatto in the parlance of the time. Skin tone did vary within families, but the degree of difference Fleming had observed seemed unusual, particularly combined with the infant's obvious newborn status.